Good morning.
Good morning. Let's do something.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Debbie Levy, and I'm a senior studying industrial engineering at Georgia Tech. I serve as the event and outreach coordinator for Wish for WASH, Engineers Without Borders at Georgia Tech. Wish for WASH's goal is to advocate and educate about human-centered design, global sanitation, and health equity to promote innovative sanitation solutions. I hope you all enjoyed the documentary, Sustainable Nation. I personally thought it was absolutely incredible to learn about the Israeli innovation for sustainable water solutions. Israel partners with countries all over the world to share technology to create a better future for everyone. The advanced technology developed by Israel in conjunction with Jewish National Fund, also known as JNF, has helped Israel become the #1 country in wastewater recycling, reusing over 85% of its water. I am a proud Jewish National Fund member where I serve various volunteer roles. I am the JNF Future Root Society donor and the Georgia Tech JNF campus liaison. Additionally, I serve on the Atlanta Board of Directors, the Atlanta Women's for Israel Steering Committee, and the Faculty Fellowship Committee. I would like to acknowledge and welcome the professors attending this event from the JNF Faculty Fellowship Program. This program is a competitive academic fellowship that invites full-time university and college faculty members to apply to participate in an all-expenses-paid academic trip to Israel. The program seeks to link scholars from diverse disciplines with their Israeli counterparts at major institutions for the purpose of initiating exchanges and collaborations. If you would like to learn more about this program, please feel free to email me. My email will be in the chat. It's an honor to host this event with JNF on campus, JNF Faculty Fellowship, Wish for WASH, Georgia Tech Engineers Without Borders, the Chabad of Georgia Tech and Georgia State, Georgia Tech Urban Media Lab, and the Northwestern University Hillel to celebrate World Toilet Day. November 19th is a day that celebrates the safe and dignified lives that hygienic toilets provide us and raises awareness for the 4.2 billion people living without access to safely managed sanitation. This year's World Toilet Day theme is sustainable sanitation and climate change. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Clive Lipchin, Director of the Center for Transboundary Water Management at the Arava Institute in Israel. Dr. Lipchin brings together water professionals and policymakers across Israel, the Palestinian territories, and Jordan to foster cooperation in water conservation, desalination, and wastewater management and education. A respected scholar, Dr. Lipchin has published and presented widely on the topic of transboundary water management in the Middle East. As a faculty member of the Arava Institute, he teaches a multidisciplinary course on water management in the Middle East and oversees research projects, workshops, conferences focused on transboundary water and environmental problems. Clive will answer any questions about the film, Sustainable Nation, and share water and sustainability initiatives at the Arava Institute, including, but not limited to, his sustainable solar-powered toilet system currently functioning in the Bedouin village of Batin, Israel. Clive? I think you're on mute.
There you go. Thanks, Debbie, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to everybody come on the call today. So I'll just say a few words about the film for those that haven't found the time to see it. So the film Sustainable Nation highlights Israeli water innovation through the stories of three very unique innovators trying to solve the world's water problems. I think the most important takeaway message of the film is sort of the general, I would say, Israeli philosophy towards what many think are insurmountable problems. Israelis generally look at problems as opportunities, and Israelis are not afraid to fail. Actually, failure is always something that people are quite proud of in Israel, because you learn a lot from your failures. This is partly why Israel is so successful in its startup ecosystem, because the successful startups, the ones that you hear about, are developed on the experience of many failures. And so Israelis love to take on risky endeavors, and solving the world's water problems is one of those risky endeavors. And so this is what's highlighted in the stories of the three innovators that are featured in the film. And if you haven't seen it, please do find the time to watch the film. As Debbie mentioned, I am from the Arava Institute in Israel, and I've been working on water issues for the better part of a decade now here in Israel and the Middle East. And our innovation and our approach to addressing water issues is to think about, and this I think is very relevant to the fact that we're celebrating World Toilet Day today, is to think about how do we meet the needs in water for marginalized, low-income communities throughout the world. And we have been innovating this approach, addressing some of these issues in the Bedouin community in Israel, but beyond that, also with our work with the Palestinians in Jordan and beyond. We are also looking at doing work in Africa and in other places as well, including in the United States. To maybe get things going with Q&A and discussion, there are two areas of general innovation when it comes to how Israel has resolved its water crisis. So firstly, Israel is an arid country. We do not have a lot of water, fresh water, but yet we are able to meet the needs of our current population and even the future needs of our population and the needs of our neighbors. So hydrologically speaking, Israel is a water scarce country, but in terms of its ability to meet the needs of its population and the needs of its agricultural sector and whatnot, Israel is not a water scarce country. And that is because Israel understands the value of thinking about water differently. And that means thinking about developing what we can term non-conventional water supplies. What do I mean here? I mean two main areas. One is utilizing the technologies that are becoming more efficient over time in desalinating seawater. So I think nearly everybody probably on the call understands that Israel is a world leader in desalination, and we are now dependent on desalination for meeting about 2/3 of our domestic water supply, and developing desalination in a very efficient and sustainable way. And this requires a certain leap of faith, right? Looking at seawater not as something that is of no value for humans, but of very high value, simply by saying, look, all we have to do is remove the salts, and we have a potentially endless supply of water. That's really what desalination is all about. And the second area, which is where I do most of my work, is to also understand the value and the potential of recycling wastewater, sewage. It's quite mind-boggling when you, and again, this is very relevant to today's World Toilet Day, most of the world does not treat its sewage. Most of the world simply dumps its sewage into the environment. I'll just give you one example of a case that I looked at the other day. Ecuador in Latin America basically has polluted nearly all of its rivers because they use those rivers as receiving waters for their sewage, which they don't treat. They simply capture their sewage and dump it right into the river systems. And this has huge consequences for the environment and for public health and other issues. But Ecuador is just one example. Most of Africa is doing the same as well. So is India, so is China. Israel has understood, going back more than 30 years, the value of taking sewage and not just throwing it away, discharging it back into the environment, but capturing the sewage, treating the sewage, and recycling it for the most important source of water, which is water for agriculture. So Israel is a leader in taking wastewater and treating it and putting it back into valuable use in producing our food. So Israel's food security is very much intertwined with its ability to not rely on fresh water for irrigation, but treated wastewater. And there's a huge opportunity here in also the impact of climate change. Climate change is impacting our water resource availability throughout the world, and it's making fresh water more uncertain. The predictability of fresh water, when will it rain, when will it not rain, is becoming more problematic. And if you are a farmer dependent on rainfall, this is a huge challenge for you. You're becoming much more vulnerable because you don't know, when should I plant, when should I harvest? All of that is going, that level of unpredictability is going to increase over time. If we can replace fresh water with treated wastewater, then we are actually becoming more resilient to climate change because wastewater is very predictable. It comes in predictable quantities and it's available 24/7. We don't have to worry about drought, for example, which is a very common issue, of course, facing countries such as Israel in the Middle East. So valuing wastewater, I think, is a huge opportunity that Israel can demonstrate to countries around the world that it's doable and it can be done sustainably and it can be done efficiently and it can be done economically. And that is really where we are at this point in time. So maybe I will stop talking at this point because I really want to encourage as much Q&A and interaction as possible for the time that we have left. So I'll give it back to Debbie, maybe, to help facilitate with the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Clive. So I'll just mention a couple questions that we've received prior to this. So why is water and wastewater management a crucial transboundary issue? You're muted. Sorry, Nelson, if you could just keep Clive and I unmuted, that would be great.
Okay, so the transboundary element, another big part of the work that we do at the Institute, and something else that is of global significance, is as much as water is, let's say, an engineering issue, an issue of hydrology, an economical one, because developing water infrastructure, of course, costs money. Water is as much a political issue. Water crosses political borders, and the management of that water, therefore, becomes political when one has to make decisions on how to allocate water amongst different political entities that share, for example, a river basin. So let's start off with the US example that people might be familiar with, the Colorado River Basin, one of the most important sources of fresh water for the West Southwest. The city of Los Angeles, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Denver, Colorado. None of those cities would be around today if they weren't able to draw water from the Colorado. But the Colorado is a number of US states, each with their own different water policies. And of course, the Colorado is shared between the United States and Mexico. allocating water in that basin amongst different states with different needs, state of California versus Arizona versus Nevada, Colorado, and 2 countries is extremely complicated, and it's intensely political. In our case, in Israel, we share our water with our neighbors. All of Israel's fresh water is transboundary. Whether it's surface water like the Jordan River system, which we share with Lebanon, Syria, Israel, the Palestinians in Jordan, or if it's groundwater, which we share primarily with the Palestinians. So most of the world's water is transboundary, meaning that the political aspect of water is very, very important. And it can become very controversial when you have to make water allocation decisions under growing demand and scarcity. Of course, that could trigger, and there's a lot of concern that as scarcity increases and demand increases, whether this may contribute to conflict over water, because again, water is a basic resource and it's fundamental for human survival. So we do a lot of our work in Israel to promote people-to-people engagement in managing water across borders, mostly with our work with the Palestinians in the West Bank.
Great, thank you, Clive. And Clive, just keep your microphone unmuted right now. So the next question we have,
got it.
Awesome. The next question we have is, in regards to that, how does collaboration on agriculture and technology between Israel and countries that don't have diplomatic ties with it work?
Well, the really interesting thing about water in the political space is even where there are no overt political agreements, everybody values the opportunity of collaborating over water for 2 main reasons. One, there really is no reason to fight over water because it's such a fundamental resource. Everybody understands the basic value of water. And so there's sort of an unwritten understanding that even if we have disagreements in other spheres, it doesn't really help anyone to also disagree over water, because that will be a lose-lose. And so Israel has been collaborating either above the table or below the table for many years with respect to water technologies and experience in managing water, whether it be in farming or in the domestic sector. So I'll give you one example, which now has gone from below the table to above the table. The agreement that we now have with the UAE. Israel was collaborating with the UAE for decades at a very technical, business-oriented level. Israelis were moving in and out of the UAE. Israeli companies were operating in the UAE successfully. And in actual fact, the reason that we now have an open agreement with the UAE is because of the many years of under the table and under the radar relations, a lot of it over water and agriculture. The UAE is one of the world's most water scarce regions. They have hardly any surface water. It never rains in the UAE. So one of the reasons that the countries are coming together is the UAE understands the value of Israeli technology when it comes to water. And myself and others, we're already actively exploring projects where we can take our know-how and bring it to the Gulf, to the UAE, and of course beyond. The same thing with many other countries where Israel doesn't have open diplomatic channels. In Africa, for example, there's a strong acknowledgement of the reputability of Israeli know-how when it comes to water technology. And people are willing to put aside their political differences to work on that. And this so-called, if I could use the term, water diplomacy, is a way to build on finally getting more open and more durable political relations in the future. And so there's huge value to building on the cooperation over water so that we can move forward. We have a lot of cooperation over water with the Palestinians, even though we have lots of disagreements with the Palestinians. Even when the Palestinians pulled out of negotiating with Israel and the United States during the Trump administration, the cooperation over water never ended. The work that I do in the West Bank never ended. If anything, it's actually increased over the last year or two.
Great, thank you. Another question we got from Vidor, sorry if I mispronounced your name, is when we visited a kibbutz in the Gaza Strip last year, or on the border of the Gaza Strip last year, one of the concerns was raised was groundwater quality, primarily because of a very limited infrastructure that exists in Gaza to treat wastewater. What specifically has been done to address this issue?
So in actual fact, the Arava Institute is now quite active in promoting water and wastewater infrastructure in Gaza. The issue there is, as the question said, is the question of deteriorating groundwater quality because of overpumping. So what this means is that the salinity of the groundwater is increasing over time because of seawater intrusion into the aquifer. The ultimate solution for Gaza is desalination along the same lines as Israel. And projects have been approved to build seawater desalination for Gaza, as well as improving Gaza's wastewater infrastructure to minimize the discharge of wastewater into the sea, which is mostly because of the lack of energy that Gaza receives. So we know the solutions that have to happen in Gaza. It's very politically sensitive, of course, but the Arava Institute has just actually gotten approval from the Israeli government to import wastewater technology into Gaza. And some of you may have seen this in the media. We are working with an Israeli company called Watergen, which is a company that produces water from the air, what's called atmospheric water generation technology. And we have installed 2 Watergen facilities in Gaza with full and open collaboration with the Israeli government and the people we're working with on the ground in Gaza. So that's a great example of the previous point of a hydro diplomacy, for example.
Great, thank you. Another question we have from Barb is, how do we and Israel balance ecosystem water needs with needs for human survival? Is there a strategy to approach this problem? Okay,
I'm very pleased that question was raised, because that's one of our problems which we haven't resolved. Because over the years, the focus has been primarily on providing water for people, we have not fully addressed the issue of what are the ecological challenges to that. So for example, from the 60s and the 70s, when Israel began to pump water out of the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, via the National Water Carrier, that had huge ecological consequences to the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. And today we are faced with that legacy of a Jordan River and a Dead Sea that are massively ecologically degraded. The Dead Sea now is receding at over 1 meter a year. We have thousands of sinkholes that have opened up around the Dead Sea, making the Dead Sea, in my opinion, our biggest environmental challenge. Our rivers are also quite polluted because of a lack of infrastructure for wastewater treatment on the West Bank and the wastewater flowing from the West Bank to Israel. So we have a lot of ecological challenges to our ecosystems, and the solution to rehabilitating our ecological systems is also through wastewater treatment. Just as we are able to treat wastewater to a high quality so it can be safely used in irrigation, we can also treat wastewater to an ecological standard to rehabilitate our rivers. There is now work moving forward to do this. We have some good examples. The Kishon River that flows through Haifa has been very well managed and rehabilitated. The Alexander River that flows through Netanya as well. So we have some good successes, but the biggest challenge is the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. And the solution to that will also require a political agreement between Jordan and the Palestinians, who also share that resource. We all need to come together to save the Dead Sea. That's something we're also working on at the Institute, to try to build the consortium, the collaboration to make that happen.
Great, thank you. A question that we have from Ruben is, one of the major issues that we have in the US is runoff from livestock operations, for example, poultry production facilities that pollute rivers and streams. How does Israel manage animal food production with the need for preservation of fresh water? Is there the same problem or not in Israel with agricultural runoff?
we have similar problems, but not at the scale of the United States. But for example, agricultural runoff from dairy farms in Israel is, I would say the way that we deal with these issues is we have very strict regulations on water quality discharges into the environment and a very well developed enforcement mechanism. So all dairy farms in Israel have to receive wastewater discharge permits before they will be given licenses to operate, and they are monitored frequently by the government. We do have problems, of course, like any country, but we have a high level of compliance, and agricultural runoff is also required to go into treatment facilities where, dependent on the kind of wastewater that's produced, we either will send that to domestic wastewater treatment facilities where it gets recycled, or it goes into separate wastewater treatment facilities for agricultural waste. So agricultural runoff is not a big problem in Israel, mostly because we have good policies in place and good enforcement, and also good compliance by the farmers themselves to minimize that as a problem.
Great, thank you. This question is from David. I live in the Pacific Northwest, a region that most people think is water rich. However, the inland Northwest is like most of the rest of the Western US, which is fairly arid, with agricultural supported largely by irrigation or growth of a few crop species, mostly wheat and barley, that can be dry farmed on a large scale. Our wastewater is treated, although nothing like as it's done in Israel, but completely insufficient for sustaining our agricultural industry. We are completely reliant on the Columbia River system. How do you see the Western US evolving with regards to this system of agriculture? And importantly, what do you recommend as changes in policy or direction that should be implemented? And what can we learn from Israel in regard to this region?
Well, I would start off by maybe being a little bit controversial. I don't think agriculture on the scale of how it's been developed in the West is anywhere close to being sustainable. I think that the fact that pretty much nearly 100% of surface water across the West, going from the Pacific Northwest all the way down to Southern California, those rivers have all been massively engineered primarily to serve farmers. A lot of that water now, of course, is shifting to growing cities. And so I think the issue that the West is facing is how much longer can large-scale, massively inefficient agriculture continue in the West? Mostly because irrigation is still flood irrigation. There is drip irrigation, of course, but not anywhere close to what it is in Israel. And I think the future of the West and water is a question of what is the future of agriculture in the West, especially when you're growing things, as you mentioned, wheat and barley. I think you mentioned these are very low value crops. Most of the cereal crops that are grown in the West don't even go to human consumption. They go to grow cattle for meat consumption by people. So there's a huge unsustainability in the way agriculture has developed over 200-300 years in which this was developed throughout the United States Western region. So this is a question that the West has to ask itself. What's the future? If the future is agriculture, it's not sustainable. Even if you were to develop large-scale desalination and wastewater treatment, the geographic scale of moving water from place to place is massively expensive. So the advantage that Israel has and why we've been able to develop these technologies efficiently is we're simply a small country. So the distribution cost of water in Israel is very low because we're going to move water, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers. In order to move water, let's say from the Pacific Northwest coastal region into the inland areas of the state, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers. It's not economically feasible. So there's a bigger question here. Should the West continue to be the breadbasket of America? It's not going to last, and so this is a this is a question for the 21st century. So, you know, I think that's really what people living in those places are going to have to grapple with, because it's completely unsustainable. Again, my opinion, I did say controversial, but this is my read as a non-American who's looked into this.
Thank you so much, Clive. I know we have some more questions, but I still want to have time for Clive to share about his incredible project with the solar toilet in the Bedouin village of Umbatin. So Clive, if you'd like to share a little bit about that, and afterwards we can answer questions about that or continue with the questions from the chat.
Yeah, sure. So what we've been developing in the Bedouin community, and let me just start off by saying that our work with the Bedouin and in helping their sanitation issues is work that is being sponsored by the JNF. The JNF Water Task Force is a critical partner in the work that we're doing in wastewater management for the Bedouin and other marginalized communities. So basically, what is happening in the Bedouin community, many of the villages are not connected to the sewer grids. So they rely on very inefficient septic tanks, or what we call cesspits. Basically, they discharge their wastewater into unlined holes in the ground, which means that the wastewater eventually will percolate and contaminate the aquifer. It's also a public health risk as well. So there's a huge inefficiency of water management, which goes against the efficiency of wastewater management at a national level in Israel. So we are targeting these communities to try to find the best possible approach to improving their wastewater management, with the understanding that it's unlikely that these communities will be connected to a sewer grid, mostly because of the cost of connection. So we have piloted and pioneered decentralized technologies that can take the untreated wastewater from the Bedouin community, treat that wastewater on site, and then provide the recycled water directly back to the Bedouin. This is a much more efficient way of solving the problem. Firstly, the Bedouin are semi-rural. Agriculture is a very important part of their way of life. It's a very important part of their culture, both animal husbandry and more conventional farming. And so their biggest challenge with water is water for agriculture. And using fresh water is very expensive and very inefficient. So we are coming in and demonstrating that we can solve two of the Bedouins' problems with one technology. Treat their wastewater, in other words, allow them to no longer rely on these very inefficient and problematic cesspits, and give the wastewater back directly to the farmers in the terms of high quality treated wastewater for irrigation. So we have piloted this technology in the Bedouin community. We have received a lot of interest from the government to support this. The Ministry of Agriculture is interested in our work. The Ministry of Economy actually recently gave us support, financial support, to produce, to assist us in developing our technology. And so we hope to do more of this work in the Bedouin community, but not just in the Bedouin, beyond. We feel that we have an opportunity here to solve similar problems for similar communities in other parts of the Middle East and the world as well.
So thank you so much, Clive. It's incredible. And we're so excited about that project that you're doing over there. So you said that you're interested in bringing this technology to other parts of the world. So how do you plan on scaling the project? Like, what are the challenges, and and how much would this cost? Is it going to be complete? Are we looking for donations for this?
So there's a number of questions there, right? So scale is very important. At the moment, we are piloting the technology, but at a small scale. We're treating between 2 to 4 cubic meters of wastewater per day. That's roughly the amount of wastewater that let's say 10 to 20 people would produce. To go to scale is essential. We are thinking about that and developing, scaling our system where we can treat at least 200 people, which could be a small neighborhood or even a small village. That's an average of 25 cubic meters of wastewater per day. And our third pilot, which is now underway, is a scaled up 25 cubic meter per day system. In terms of costs, it's very important that as we develop the technology in parallel, we develop the appropriate business plan and economic plan as well. There are many opportunities here, depending on who you're serving. And so you will have different ways of developing this. For example, one model is that people that you serve pay for water, right? In Israel, we pay for water, we pay for sewage. I think pretty much everybody here in the United States on the call does the same. We understand that water costs. Water is not free. So a business model is that we develop a water usage fee for the water that is both treated and recycled. Another option is, of course, to work with donors, specifically if we will be working in places like Africa. We would want to partner with the donor community where they would be able to develop and produce the financial resources to develop projects. And finally, we would be able to also look at potential clients that will be happy to pay for the technology. Remember, this is a problem that's not only being faced in the developing world, it's a problem being faced all around the world, including places where there is a high-end use of water, like hotels in isolated or far-off places that would also need to address their sanitation issues. So there are different business models that have to be looked at dependent on where you are going to be offering your service.
Thanks, Clive. So in regards to the Sustainable Nation film, are you also looking to connect with the Innovation Africa to possibly implement these solar-powered toilets at the villages that they're already working on to, find water?
So I know Sivan very well. She's a friend and a colleague, and the Innovation Africa model is certainly one that we could consider in partnership because Sivan is focusing on providing drinking water to the communities in Africa. But the end result could be that the way that she has developed her model is quite similar to the way that we're thinking, and there's no question that there's opportunities for partnerships. However, I would say that where Sivan is working, the amount of sewage generated is very low. She's working in very, very isolated and very, very, very marginalized communities. So we would probably not be working in the same areas. If I'm thinking about Africa for wastewater treatment, I'm thinking about more of the urban areas. So I'll give you one example. Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Addis Ababa is a city of 5 million people and growing. Capital of Ethiopia, of course. Only 3% of Addis Ababa has a sewer grid. That means nearly all of the wastewater is being discharged directly into rivers that flow through the city. So Addis Ababa would be a example of a place where we will be able to offer a service because wastewater is being generated and there is a huge problem and there's no centralized infrastructure to deal with the issue. And Addis Ababa is very typical of most African towns and cities. Nairobi, another example. So we will be interested in entering those markets, which is not the same markets that Sivan is interested in, but Sivan certainly presents a opportunity of partnership because she's known in Africa, she brings Israeli technologies into Africa, and she is certainly a well-recognized face across Africa. So we would be very happy to find ways to develop joint projects with Innovation Africa.
Incredible. And in regards to this pandemic, are you tracking COVID-19 through sewage and how does this work? And is this more efficient than the normal COVID testing that they're doing right now? And what is the scale of it?
So thank you, Debbie. So that's another project that we've begun recently, also with the support of the JNF Water Task Force. So basically what we're doing is the following. So we now know that the virus is present in sewage and can be identified in sewage. So what do I mean? If you are infected with the virus, and whether you are symptomatic or asymptomatic of the disease of COVID-19, you will shed the virus into the sewer when you go to the toilet. We can pick up that virus when we monitor for wastewater for the virus. And the opportunities here are that you can develop a pre-screening tool to track where future outbreaks are going to happen. So for example, if there is a community discharging its sewage into a sewer grid, we can map the sewer grid and take samples from the sewer grid for different, let's say, neighborhoods in the community. And we will then be able to say which communities have a risk factor for infection of the disease. Now, why do I say pre-screening? Because when you get infected, there's roughly a 14-day lag time before you show symptoms. So when I'm testing for the virus in sewage, I'm being able to determine 14 days in advance where an outbreak may occur. And this is very useful to the policymakers because I can take a city and I can say, look, that neighborhood in 10 to 14 days time is going to have an outbreak, whereas that other neighborhood is not. So focus, let's say, a lockdown measure or some kind of containment measure for the neighborhood where we can see ahead of time where a potential outbreak will happen. This is hugely important because at the moment, when we talk about COVID-19 testing, we're testing individuals and we're testing individuals that seek to get tested, meaning people that already think they're infected or people that are infected. What about all the asymptomatic people walking around that are infecting others, right? That's our biggest problem. That's why lockdowns are so problematic and controversial. If you are, you know, why it's so difficult to decide about what to do with the schools. Open the schools or close the schools, because kids are infected, but they're not sick. But they're infecting their parents or their grandparents who are higher risk. So if we can get a pre-screening process in place, it could very much help us to put into place better policies and to say, where should we be focusing our resources and so on. So it's a very important tool that we need to add to our COVID-19 toolbox. And now in Israel, there is a national sewage testing project going forward with the Ministry of Health. And our work is very much contributing to that because we are focusing on sewage testing in the Bedouin community, which very little testing has been done, partly because of the difficulty of the government to communicate to the Bedouin, mistrust by the Bedouin of the government. There are many issues here. So we are working very closely with the Ministry of Health, with Ben-Gurion University that's doing the lab analysis of our work. And in the end, we hope to develop a useful public policy tool that we would want to share with the rest of Israel and the rest of the world, of course. There's already been interest to have some of our work be done in the West Bank with the Palestinians, because of course, in terms of the disease, there's a spread of the disease, you know, between Palestinians and Israelis. And so there's interest on both sides to try to understand what's going on, whether one is in the West Bank or where one is in Israel, for example. And again, let me make sure that I give credit to the JNF, because this is where the JNF, I think, is taking the lead, is supporting, again, very innovative and cutting edge, not just technologies, but addressing the pandemic through understanding, again, how water is linked to all of this. Remember, sanitation is a big part of how you prevent disease, whether it be COVID or anything else. So if you don't have water, you can't keep clean. If you can't keep clean, you're at higher risk of infection.
Wow, that's incredible, Clive. And it's so great to hear about all the progress that is going on and your projects, and we look forward to hearing more about what happens with it. So good luck with that, and thank you so much for sharing. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jean McLean as our final speaker. Dr. McLean received her doctorate from Duke University in microbial ecology after earning a science degree in forest science from Yale University and a bachelor's degree in forestry from the University of Vermont. She is the Associate Director of the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center and a research scientist at the Water Resources Research Center in the Department of Soil, Water, and Environmental Science. Dr. McLean also participated in the Jewish National Fund Fellows Program in 2019. Thank you, Dr. McLean, for being here to help conclude today's program.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be able to give the closing commentary. Thank you so much, Dr. Lipchin, for that very informative presentation. And thank you so much, Debbie, for organizing. This has been a great event. As Debbie said, I am an alumnus of the Faculty Fellowship Program. In 2013, I traveled to Israel with a group of faculty. It's really interesting how this came together for me, because before applying to the Faculty Fellowship, I had little knowledge of the history of the region, even the JNF. But I applied to the fellowship because I'm a water microbiologist. I do research into the public health of water reclamation. So as Dr. Lipchin said, Israel is at the forefront of the world in this technology. And another place where that technology is really exploding is Arizona. We have similar climates, obviously, and similar issues, political and, well, yeah, policy and otherwise. So I did go to Israel with a group of faculty and learned a lot about the rich history of that region. It was almost embarrassing how little I knew. How did I get to the age of 50 years old and not understand the history of this region of the world? But another thing that happened is I made connections with faculty in Israel that are fruitful even to this day. Fruitful in that, you know, not just making social connections, but also connections that have allowed me to bring funding into my programs. And I'm currently writing a proposal with one of the faculty that I met in 2013. One thing we did during the fellowship trip is we spent a night at Arava Institute, and that was so memorable for me. And to get into a little why it was so memorable, Debbie said, my undergraduate degree is in forestry from the University of Vermont. I have a place in my heart for trees. And I had known of this incredible Methuselah tree that I never thought I would get to see in my life. And there it was at the Arava Institute. So most of you probably know that Methuselah is an ancient date palm that was grown in Judea, but had not been grown for many hundreds of years before they were able to cultivate Methuselah. And for me, it was almost like meeting a movie star. So, but since the fellowship, I have had the opportunity to speak about the experience several times. There was a JNF meeting in Phoenix, and I was able to speak to some of the donors about the impact that this program is having on relationships between faculty in the US and Israel. The University of Arizona is also involved in the establishment of a joint institute for global food, water, and energy security that is I don't know if this is the right word, but managed by JNF, and Arava Institute is also a big part of that. And this is bringing technology to build food, water, and energy security in vulnerable communities in Africa and elsewhere throughout the world. Other University of Arizona faculty have also taken part. I know of one, Dr. Kevin Fitzsimmons, who went on the faculty fellowship 2 years before I did, and he has built similar relationships. He is currently working on a JNF funded project with the Arava Institute. So I promised I wouldn't talk long, so I won't, although I could talk about this experience for hours, but I promised I won't. For those of you who are in the US, I wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving, a happy socially distanced Thanksgiving. And for everyone else, very happy upcoming holidays.
Thank you so much, Dr. McLean. And if anyone else is interested to learn more about getting involved and applying to be a faculty fellow and learning more about these projects and what Clive is doing, his incredible work in Israel, thank you so much, Clive. Please don't hesitate to email me. My email is in the chat. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for celebrating World Toilet Day and learning about Israeli technology. Have a wonderful rest of your day.